He found out his wife was still with her AP while begging him to take her back, and it changes everything. There she was, his wife, asking him to take her back. Not because she realized what she had. Not because she had a moment of clarity or genuine remorse. But because things with the other man were not going so great anymore. Let that sit with you for a second. She blew up their entire marriage, chose another man, and then when that other man did not work out the way she planned, she came back around like nothing happened. And he almost let her. This is the update to a story that started in a place of real pain. Back in that first post, this guy was deep in the denial stage and he knew it even then. He was sitting in therapy, early into the process, still desperately trying to find some version of reality where saving this relationship made sense. He was willing to bend himself into impossible shapes just to keep something that was already gone. He was replaying conversations in his head, scanning them for the thing he should have said differently, the moment he could have changed the trajectory of everything. He was auditioning better versions of himself in his own mind, wondering if a different husband could have kept her. And what is wild is that reading his original words back now, even he cannot believe what he was willing to put himself through. So let us go back to the beginning and understand the full picture. His wife had been seeing another man. Not some guy her own age, not someone she stumbled into something complicated with. Her affair partner was 49 years old. She was 23. There is an entire lifetime of difference between those two people, and she chose that over her marriage. She was not confused. She was not lost. She was not caught in some irresistible emotional current she could not swim against. She made a decision, a clear and deliberate one, and she made it while her husband was sitting at home trying to figure out what he could do better. While he was asking himself what he was missing, what he was failing at, she already had her answer and it had nothing to do with anything he did wrong. And here is the part that makes this so much harder to process. When you are in the thick of something like this, your brain does not think clearly. Betrayal does something to a person that is almost impossible to explain unless you have been through it. You start questioning everything you thought you knew about your own life. You go back through every memory and wonder what was real. Was she thinking about him during moments you thought were just yours? Was she comparing you in ways you never knew to defend yourself against? Were there signs you missed or signs you saw and talked yourself out of believing because the alternative was too enormous to sit with? He was doing all of that painful internal archaeology while simultaneously trying to hold open the door in case she wanted to come back. That is not weakness. That is what grief looks like when it is happening to a real person in real time, not a movie version of one. He had already started therapy by the time that first post went up, which shows he was trying. He was doing the work. He was not just spiraling in silence, he was actively trying to get himself through it. He was showing up to sessions even when showing up felt like the hardest possible thing to ask of himself. He was sitting across from a therapist and saying things out loud that he probably had not fully admitted even to himself yet. But therapy at the beginning of something this painful is like trying to hold back floodwater with your hands. You are learning the tools while the damage is still happening all around you. The sessions can give you language and perspective, but the wound is still fresh and every day brings something new that tears it back open. He was in the earliest stages of trying to rebuild a sense of self that had been completely demolished by someone who was supposed to be his partner, the one person in the world who had chosen him and meant it, or at least who he believed had meant it. And then she came back around. Because of course she did. The affair partner, the 49-year-old man she had left her husband for, was apparently juggling two other women on the side besides her. So the great romance she had chosen over her marriage turned out to be exactly what everyone on the outside could have told her it would be. She was not special to him. She was not his priority. She was not the exception he had been waiting for. She was one of three, and when that reality started to set in, when the illusion of whatever she thought she had found cracked open and showed her what was underneath, she looked back toward the life she had burned down and thought maybe she could move back in. Like the smoke had cleared enough that it looked livable again. Like he would just be there, waiting, grateful she had reconsidered, ready to pretend the last however many months had simply not happened. Oh, she also had the audacity to plan a trip to Vegas with this man while telling her husband she needed time to herself. Not time away from the relationship to reflect. Not space to figure things out honestly. She told him she was taking time to herself and she used that time to plan a vacation with the affair partner. She sat across from her husband, or texted him, or however that conversation happened, and said the words that were designed to buy her space and patience and goodwill, and then she used that space to book flights and hotel rooms with another man. That is not confusion. That is not someone trying to figure out what they want. That is someone actively lying while keeping a backup option warm just in case, someone who had already made her choice but wanted the safety net to stay in place while she tested how solid the ground was on the other side. I genuinely cannot decide what makes me more frustrated. The cheating itself, or the level of casual deception that came after it. Like, lying about taking time to yourself while booking Vegas trips with another man is a special kind of cold. And he knew. That is the part the story does not always make clear, but you can feel it underneath everything he wrote. He knew on some level that this was not salvageable. He knew that what was happening was not a rough patch or a moment of poor judgment. He knew his wife had made a choice and that the choice was not him. But knowing something and being able to act on it are two completely different things, especially when you are still in love with the person who hurt you. Especially when part of your brain is still hoping the person you married is somewhere underneath all of this. The brain in grief does not move in a straight line. It circles. It bargains. It presents you with the most optimistic possible interpretation of every piece of evidence, even when the evidence is overwhelming and sitting right in front of you. He knew, and he stayed anyway for a while, and that is not a failure. That is just what loving someone and losing them at the same time actually feels like in your chest every single morning. The filing had already happened by the time their final conversation came in December. They were not in the stage of deciding anymore. The decision was made and the paperwork was real and the court date was coming. That final talk was not about saving anything. It was about closing something. And in that conversation he finally said enough was enough. He finally let go of whatever thread he had still been holding on to, not dramatically, not with a rehearsed speech, but with the quiet and exhausted honesty of someone who had simply run out of reasons to pretend otherwise. He acknowledged that this was over, and he allowed himself to step toward a life that was actually going to be good for him. That December conversation must have been one of the hardest things he ever did. Not because he still wanted to be with her, because by that point I do not think he did, but because saying something out loud for the final time is its own kind of grief. There is a weight to last words that first words never carry. Closing a chapter you once thought would be your whole story is painful even when closing it is absolutely the right thing to do. There is a mourning that happens not for the person who hurt you but for the version of your future you thought you were going to have. The house you might have shared. The ordinary Tuesday evenings that were supposed to just be your life together. The inside jokes that would never get made. All of it has to be grieved even when you are the one choosing to walk away from it, even when walking away is the sanest and most self-respecting thing you could possibly do. But then something happened that does not always happen in these stories. He actually got better. Not overnight, not without struggle, not in a clean upward arc with no bad days in between. But genuinely and measurably and visibly better. He found someone new. Someone who values him for who he is, not for what he can provide financially or what convenience he represents in her life. Someone who sits with him and makes Pokemon teams for characters in the Dungeons and Dragons podcast they listen to together. And I know that might sound like a small detail, but that detail tells you everything. That is not two people performing compatibility for each other. That is not two people trying to seem like the right fit. That is two people who have found each other in their most specific and particular interests and decided to share them without embarrassment or reservation. That is two people choosing each other in the most ordinary and beautiful everyday ways, which is ultimately the only way that actually counts. His ex has apparently kept breaking no contact after the divorce to ask if he is stirring up drama about this or that situation. Which is fascinating behavior from someone who blew up their own marriage and walked away from it by choice. She is not reaching out because she misses him or feels genuine remorse or has spent any real time sitting with what she did. She is reaching out to manage her own reputation, to do damage control, to ensure that the story being told about her out in the world is a story she can live with comfortably. She wants to know where the narrative is, who has heard what, and whether she needs to get ahead of anything. Even after everything, even after the divorce is final and done, she is still treating him like something to be managed rather than a person she actually wronged. He is not a person to her so much as a variable she wants to keep under control, a loose end she has not quite figured out how to tie off. He made the decision not to get into all the details of everything she did. Not because he is protecting her, but because he genuinely does not want to spend his mental energy there anymore. He said there is no point in reopening those chapters because he is in an objectively happier situation now. And that right there is the real victory. Not anger. Not exposure. Not vindication through some public accounting of every wrong thing she did. Just a genuine and quiet happiness that makes the past feel small, that makes the wound feel like something that happened to a previous version of him rather than something still happening now. He is not carrying it anymore. He put it down somewhere and walked away from it and kept walking until the distance made it small. So let us talk about what actually happened here, because this ending deserves to be said clearly. He did the right thing. He stayed in therapy. He filed. He had the hard conversation. He pulled the plug even though it took longer than he would have liked, even though there were probably moments where he sat in his car in a parking lot somewhere and questioned every single thing. And now 4 months past the divorce being finalized, he is in a relationship that actually makes sense for who he is, with someone who actually sees him and likes what she sees. Meanwhile, she is somewhere managing the fallout of choices she made while he has genuinely moved on and is building something real. The verdict here is not complicated. She chose someone else, lied about it, came back when that someone else did not work out, and then continued to try and manage him even after the divorce. She treated their marriage like a safety net she could jump back into whenever her main act was not going well. And he, to his enormous credit, eventually refused to be that for her. The final line he wrote in that post, that this is the final line he is writing in the story between him and his ex so he can permanently close it, hit differently than almost anything I have read in a while. Because that is not anger talking. That is not bitterness. That is someone who has actually done the work and actually come out the other side. He does not need her to be punished. He does not need everyone to know how wrong she was. He just needed to close the book, and he did. That is what healing actually looks like. She called off the engagement after her future mother-in-law booked a luxury vacation on her son's money. 4 days. That is all the time it took. For days after calling her son in tears, begging him to pay 3 months of overdue rent so she would not be evicted, this woman was posting from the Amalfi Coast. The Mediterranean. A luxury vacation destination that most people save up months to afford. And her son, the one who had just emptied his wallet for her rent, found out by seeing it happen in real time. That was the moment that ended an engagement. Let us set the scene properly, because context matters here. Our storyteller is a 25-year-old woman who had been doing everything right. She had been saving carefully, denying herself luxuries, building toward a future with real financial stability. She was not spending frivolously. She was not living beyond her means. She was being intentional and disciplined because she had a vision of what her life was going to look like as she got older. She tracked her spending, she had goals written down somewhere, she was the kind of person who thinks 3 steps ahead because she has seen what happens when you do not. And she thought her fiancé was on the same page. And technically he was. He did not spend on himself. He did not splash out on clothes or vacations or gadgets he did not need. By every measure he appeared to be a responsible and frugal partner. He brought his lunch to work. He drove an older car. He said no to things his friends said yes to. On the surface, all of that looked like discipline and shared values. The problem was that his frugality was not building toward anything. Every dollar he saved was not going into a shared future. It was flowing out the door and into his mother's life. And his mother, as it turned out, had a very different idea of what financial hardship looked like. Let me just say this plainly. Calling your adult child in a panic about eviction, accepting their money to cover 3 months of unpaid rent, and then flying to one of the most expensive coastlines in Italy within 4 days of receiving that money is genuinely one of the most breathtaking moves I have encountered in a relationship story. Think about what that actually involves. The packing. The airport. The flight. The hotel check-in with the view of turquoise water and terracotta rooftops. The leisurely meals on outdoor terraces. And somewhere back home, her son looking at his phone and watching it all appear in his feed, photo by photo. The Amalfi Coast. Not a weekend camping trip. Not a budget flight to visit a relative. The Amalfi Coast. The mother's reasoning, if we are being charitable, might have been that the money was already allocated before the rent crisis and she did not want to lose the deposit. But that explanation, even if true, does not make this better. If anything, it makes it worse. Because it means she knew she had a vacation coming up while she was calling her son in tears about not being able to pay her rent. She knew the trip was on the calendar. She knew the money was not there. She made the call anyway, with full knowledge of where the funds she was requesting were about to go. That is not a crisis. That is a plan. When the fiancé found out about the trip and confronted his mother, they got into an argument. Which is an understandable reaction. You can imagine the particular quality of that conversation, the way his voice probably went quieter as the shock settled in, the way she likely pivoted quickly from defensive to wounded, turning the confrontation around so that somehow he was the one who had done something wrong by bringing it up. That is a very specific kind of argument, the kind that leaves you more confused than when you started, unsure of how you ended up apologizing. But then our storyteller asked him the question that cracked the whole thing open. She did not ask why he paid. She already knew why. She asked how he would have done it if they were living together. Not an accusation. Not an attack. A practical, forward-looking, completely reasonable question about what their life was actually going to look like. He said he would not have paid if he had known his mother was traveling, because he thought she was genuinely at risk of eviction. And look, that is probably true. He was not lying to her in that moment. But she did not let him pivot to that. She held the frame. She kept the question on the table. Because that is the question that actually matters. Not what he would have done this specific time with this specific information. What he would do the next time. And the time after that. When the circumstances were slightly different and the story was slightly different and the tears sounded just as real. Right now he lives with his brother and pays almost nothing. No food costs, minimal rent, a situation that lets him float money to his mother without it visibly affecting anyone else. It is almost an invisible arrangement from the outside. Nobody sees the transfers leaving his account. Nobody else feels the absence of that money. It just disappears quietly into a dynamic that has been functioning this way for years, and everyone involved has gotten so comfortable with their roles that it probably does not even register as unusual anymore. But that arrangement was never going to last. Once they moved in together, once there were real bills with both their names on them, that same behavior would not happen in a vacuum anymore. His mother's financial emergencies would become their financial emergencies. And she could see that with complete clarity even if he could not. She also said something that I think is one of the most emotionally intelligent things I have read in a breakup story in a long time. She said she did not want to be the reason he changes his relationship with his mother. She did not want to be blamed. She did not want to be the woman who came between them. That is a remarkably self-aware thing to recognize, because that is exactly how it would have played out. Every boundary set, every conversation about money, every moment of hesitation on his part would eventually have been traced back to her in his mother's mind. She would have become the obstacle, the villain, the person who turned a loving son cold. So rather than asking him to choose or demanding he set limits on what he gives his mother, she chose to remove herself from that equation entirely. That is not giving up. That is recognizing a dynamic that would have poisoned everything eventually and choosing not to walk into it. Because here is what that life would have looked like. The mother would have had a crisis, and she clearly has crises regularly because 3 months of unpaid rent is not an accident, it is a pattern. A pattern that took time to develop, that required repeated rescues to sustain, that exists because someone has always shown up to absorb the consequences before they fully landed. He would have paid. The money would have come from their joint account, or from savings they were both contributing to, or it would have caused him to fall short on something they both needed. She would have had feelings about it. He would have felt torn. The mother would have sensed the tension and blamed her. And that cycle would have repeated, probably forever, because nothing she described suggests anyone in that family dynamic was interested in changing it. She did not end the engagement in anger. She did not do it as an ultimatum or a dramatic declaration. She sat down with him, had a real conversation, asked real questions, listened to his answers, and then made a calm and clear decision about her own life. There is something almost unbearably mature about that. She did not throw the ring. She did not issue demands. She just looked at the information in front of her, weighed it honestly, and chose herself. That is not impulsive. That is not cruel. That is someone who knows exactly what she needs and is willing to protect it even when it costs her something she wanted. The verdict on this one is straightforward. She made the right call. Not because he is a bad person, he is clearly not, but because the situation was not going to change. A person who has spent years as the financial safety net for a parent who is not in genuine crisis does not simply stop doing that because they got married. The behavior is too ingrained, the dynamic is too established, and the mother clearly has no intention of becoming more self-sufficient. Marrying into that was marrying into a permanent third party in their finances, and she was wise enough to see it before the paperwork was signed. The Amalfi Coast detail will live in my mind forever, honestly. Not because it is the most dramatic thing that has ever happened, but because it captures everything about this situation in one single image. A woman who calls her son crying about rent, takes his money, and then goes on a Mediterranean vacation is someone who has learned that the consequences of her choices are never really hers to deal with. And that lesson did not happen overnight. That took years of someone bailing her out to teach her. Our storyteller looked at that image clearly and understood that she was not willing to become part of the system that keeps teaching it. Drop a comment and let us know which story hit harder for you. And if you want more of this, a like and subscribe genuinely helps more than you know.